You are welcome to yet another episode of HN What's Your Say? The #1 listening show, where we discuss real issues with real people like you. We are still featuring R. Kelly. Real name Robert Sylvester Kelly. Also known as the R&B King. When we look closely at the appeal hearing in R. Kelly's New York case, one section stands out as both puzzling and deeply troubling. It's the segment where the government attempted to justify its use of the forced labor statute against him. Now, most people have a general understanding of what forced labor means. We think of situations where individuals are compelled to work against their will. Like sweatshop workers, traffic domestic servants, or cases where people are literally forced into grueling labor under threat of violence. The law itself was designed for those kinds of extreme circumstances: involuntary servitude, coerced physical toil, and work extracted through threats and abuse. But in R. Kelly's case, prosecutors chose to expand that definition far beyond its original purpose. They argued that sexual activity itself, even consensual sex, could be classified as labor. The problem is, once you redefine consensual sex itself as labor, the statute loses all clarity.
I think as to labor and service, under this court's definitions of those recently in Raniere and recently in Marcus, sexual activity, I think, clearly falls within the definition of the expenditure of physical or mental effort, especially when fatiguing, difficult, or compulsory, the performance of work commanded or paid for by another. And of course, in the context of prostitution, I think that the court would have no issue finding that that constitutes forced labor. And here, this is no different. A sex act is a sex act.
The issue is the labor component,
Yeah.
It seems to me. So what does the isolation have to do with labor? It might all be true, but where is their labor?
For example, the women were forced to give over collateral. Geronda, who was one of the victims of the forced labor charge, testified about how she had to write false letters. Faith also was forced to send a text
But is
message.
that the labor? So writing false letters is the labor?
No, the labor
I mean,
would
Raniere,
be...
these folks were doing other things. They were doing things for free, right? That would be easily described as labor. Some of it sexual, some of it not.
Well, again, I think that people pay money for work on websites, people pay money for transcribing tapes and reviewing articles, and people pay money for sex.
The appellate judge asked the most obvious question in response to the government's claim: so what does the isolation have to do with labor? It might all be true, but where is their labor? That simple question cut right through the government's shaky reasoning. Because at the heart of this forced labor conviction lies a profound contradiction. If the judge himself cannot clearly identify what the labor was, then how could they convict beyond a reasonable doubt? And how did the appeal court manage to ignore such a loophole and uphold the trial court's conviction? Let's unpack exactly what the government said. First, they argued that sex itself is labor because it requires physical and mental effort. They tried to frame it in terms of fatigue and exertion. In their words, sex is the expenditure of physical or mental effort, especially when fatiguing, difficult, or compulsory. By this logic, sex acts performed by alleged victims were essentially a form of work. Work that R. Kelly compelled them to perform without pay. But this definition is bizarre when compared to actual precedent. The forced labor statute was never intended to equate sex with employment or labor. It was written to address compelled services like domestic chores, farm work, factory exploitation, or unpaid service in a trafficking context. Stretching it to cover private and intimate activity between adults is a distortion that undermines the statute's integrity. And the appellate judge was not convinced. The judge pressed, a sex act is a sex act. The issue is the labor component, it seems to me. That is the central flaw. Sex itself is already covered under other criminal statutes when coercion is involved. Statutes dealing with sexual assault, exploitation, or trafficking exist for this purpose. To then repackage those same acts as labor is essentially double counting. It criminalizes the same conduct twice under two different legal theories. Something legally unacceptable. When pressed further, the government tried to point to other acts as evidence of labor. They mentioned Geronda allegedly being forced to write false letters. They pointed to Faith being pressured to send a text message. But here's where the argument falls apart. If the only labor prosecutors can identify is the writing of a letter or the sending of a text, then we are no longer talking about forced labor in any meaningful sense. Those are isolated trivial acts and not ongoing coerced work. They don't compare in any way to the situations Congress had in mind when the statute was written. And with such bizarre arguments by the state attorney, you cannot help but wonder, why exactly is R. Kelly still in prison? Think about it, if writing a single false letter is now considered forced labor, then where does the line get drawn? Could any action a person takes under pressure, like writing an apology note, sending a message, or making a phone call, suddenly become a federal crime under the forced labor statute? If so, the law becomes completely unrecognizable. The government attempted to lean on precedent, specifically the Raniere case. In Raniere, victims were coerced into performing actual unpaid services, transcribing, clerical work, and other tangible tasks that fit neatly within the definition of labor, and this was done over time. But even the government's own comparisons exposed the weakness of their case. In Raniere, the labor was clear, identifiable, and sustained. In Kelly's trial, the government could only fall back on sex acts which are already governed by other laws, and on scattered tasks like letters and texts. The judge's skepticism was palpable. So writing false letters is the labor? That's the labor? Even in that moment you can sense the difficulty the government had in holding its argument together. This is not just a technical quibble. The misuse of the forced labor statute has profound consequences. Criminal law requires precise definitions. The Constitution demands that citizens know exactly what conduct is prohibited so that prosecutions don't become arbitrary or unfair. If labor can mean sex or simply writing a letter or even a text, then the statute has no clear boundaries. Prosecutors can bend it to fit almost any set of facts. That's dangerous not just for R. Kelly but for the legal system as a whole. A neutral listener cannot help but notice the weakness here. Meanwhile, the appellate judges had the opportunity to strike down this bizarre use of the statute. The flaws were out in the open, highlighted by their own questions. Yet in the end the conviction stood. And that raises the unsettling question: if even judges acknowledge the ambiguity, how could the jury have had a clear standard to convict? And how did the appeal court final decision forget this arguments? Let's go step by step. The government claimed that sexual activity is inherently labor because it involves effort. But by that logic, any human interaction could be classified as labor. A hug, a kiss, a handshake, all require effort. Does that make them labor under federal law? Clearly not. The definition collapses when applied in this way. The government also tried to salvage its case by citing isolated acts like false letters or text messages. But single and isolated acts do not equal sustained labor. They are incidental. And if those count as forced labor, then every such action in any human relationship could be criminalized at the federal level. The reliance on Raniere is misleading. In that case, the victims were performing unpaid clerical and administrative tasks. Those are easily recognizable as labor. And by contrast, Kelly's case had no comparable element. Trying to conflate the two is like comparing apples to oranges. Total confusion. Right? If appellate judges themselves struggled to pin down what constituted labor in this case, then the jury was likely just as confused. Convictions cannot be based on vague or contradictory theories. When the definition of the crime is unclear, the defendant is supposed to benefit from that doubt. But in this case, R. Kelly did not benefit from any doubt. Instead, he was convicted under a definition of forced labor so broad and so unclear that it effectively rewrote the statute. This should trouble everyone regardless of their opinion of R. Kelly as an individual. Because if prosecutors can redefine forced labor to mean whatever they want to mean, whether sex or a letter or a text, then the law is no longer a shield of justice. It becomes a weapon of convenience for the government. The appellate hearing exposed these flaws in real time. The judge asked the right questions. The government gave contradictory answers. And yet the conviction survived. Listening to that exchange alone, any neutral observer is left with the same thought: This is not what Congress intended when it wrote the forced labor statute. This is not how the law is supposed to work. If the statute can be stretched this far, then no one's rights are secure. And that is why R. Kelly's conviction on forced labor should be recognized for what it is, a misuse of the law built on shaky definitions and riddled with loopholes that should never have passed appellate scrutiny. That is all we had for you today on HN What's Your Say? To keep updated whenever we post a new video, subscribe to this channel now. Also remember to hit the bell icon and enable notifications. And feel free to share your opinions with us in the comment section below, and let us know if you would like us to publish your views in our next release. We value all our subscribers' opinions.